At the time of the Hittite downfall, Assyria was already an old, scarred wolf that had known fat times and lean. Its people were the descendants of Semites who had settled along the middle Tigris and eventually looked for political leadership to Ashur. The city, so called for the god Ashur, who became the national deity and also gave his name to the Assyrians. Fertile soil of the Assyrian plains produced fine crops of barley and sesame and good pasturage for cattle and horses. And much of the country is blessed by rainfall sufficient to render irrigation unnecessary in normal times. Assyria was therefore an object of envy to the predatory peoples of the grim mountains and barren steppes in the north and east. Moreover, it was only natural that the established powers of the Middle East should seek to control a territory that by accident of geography lay athwart the major trade routes between Babylonia and Anatolia from the Mediterranean east beyond the Zagros Mountains. For survival's sake, Assyria's sturdy farmers became fierce warriors, who fought at first in defense of their homeland, and then to maintain their security by establishing around them a ring of buffer states. And finally, in a progression that was perhaps inevitable, to expand an empire that, in military might, would stand second to none. In so doing, they wrote a bloody chapter in the history of humankind, one that was all the uglier because it featured deliberate terror and atrocity as instruments of foreign policy. In an early example of the frightfulness that would later become an Assyrian hallmark, a king named Shalmaneser I, who reigned from 1274 to 1245 BCE, carried 14,000 defeated enemy soldiers off to Assyria as slaves, after securing their docility by blinding them. By then, the Assyrians had sloughed off their one-time overlords, the Mitanni, and secured a realm of some 12,000 square miles that stretched from the foothills of the Zagros west to the Euphrates. Shalmaneser's son, Tukulti-Ninurta I, whose reign began in 1244 BCE, significantly expanded that territory. For many years, the northeastern Assyrian frontier had been raided by Hurrian tribes who dwelled in the Zagros, a region known to the Assyrians as the Nahri lands. Determined to stop the incursions and to acquire for himself metals, cattle, and horses with which the northern clans were amply endowed, Tukulti-Ninurta marched into the mountains and defeated, by his count, no fewer than 40 kings from Nahri, whom he enslaved and transported to Assur with heavy copper chains around their bowed necks. In time they were allowed to return home as vassals. While Tukulti-Ninurta was busy with the Nahri lands, trouble arose in the more important front. For longer than a century, Babylonia and Assyria had been at odds over claims to the territory that lay between them. Now, Babylonian's king Kashtilash saw what he thought was an opportunity to settle matters by attacking his preoccupied neighbor. It was a monumental mistake. Tukulti-Ninurta rushed back with his warriors from the north, overwhelmed the Babylonian armies, captured the brash Kashtilash, and, in Assyrian's own words, trod with my feet upon his royal neck as though it was a footstool. Babylon was looted, and Tukulti-Ninurta declared himself the king of Babylonia. The huge statue of Marduk, Babylonian's greatest deity, was hauled away to Ashur. The results of victory over Babylonia were not all beneficial. A nation of rude peasants and warriors, Assyria was now exposed to Babylon's strong, sophisticated, and pervasive culture. Factions sympathetic to Babylon found firm foothold in the Assyrian homeland. The stolen Marduk rose to prominence among Assyrian deities. Accordingly, when Babylonia later rose in successful revolt, it was taken in high Assyrian circles that the plundered gods were demonstrating their anger over Tukulti-Ninurta's misdeeds. And so, according to a chronicle, it happened that Tukulti-Ninurta, who had brought his hand for evil against Babylon, came to a sorry end. His son and the nobles of Assyria rebelled against him and tore him from his throne. They shut him up and slew him with a sword. After Tukulti-Ninurta's death in 1208, less than a decade before the Hittite Empire was crushed by rampaging sea peoples, Assyria suffered an extended period of internal confusion and economic disarray. During this time, too, the fires of conflict, heating ever-turbulent crucible of the Middle East, burned particularly hot as aggressive peoples, such as the Philistines, Arameans, Hebrews, and Canaanites, pushed and shoved one another for a position. In these widely unsettled conditions, almost a century would pass before Assyrians were prepared to step into the void that the Hittites had left in the Middle Eastern power structure. At last, under Tilgath-Pilser I, who assumed the throne in 1115 BCE, the country's agricultural economy was made to flourish. With prosperity came political stability, and the king could concentrate on military matters so important to Assyrian rulers. Changes were being made in the Assyrian army. Although charioteers remained the elite, a new form of warfare was evolving, crushing attacks by a massed weight of infantry drawn from the peasantry, wielding bronze weapons and protected by bronze helmets, corselets, and shields. Tilgath-Pilser soon put the new tactics to a test. The same year in which Tilgath-Pilser became king, Assyria was threatened by tribespeople known as the Mushki, who had crossed the Taurus Mountains to Anatolia and were moving down the Tigris towards Nineveh. Tilgath-Pilser eagerly advanced to meet them, and before long the severed heads of the Mushki chieftains were decorating Nineveh's gates. Next, he launched an attack on the hillfolks of the Nari lands, who had risen up against their Assyrian masters. Traversing 16 mountains, he triumphed over an alliance of 23 Nari chiefs, while driving 60 others and their people northward. From the tribes they had subjugated, the victorious Assyrians extracted an enormous annual tribute consisting of 12,000 horses and 2,000 cattle. More menacing than either the Mushki or the Nari were the Arameans. These Semitic people had moved east from the Syrian desert and settled along the entire length of the Euphrates from the Babylonian border northward. Standing as a barrier to the trade between Assyria and the Syrian coast, they constantly raided Assyrian territory. To remedy the situation, Tilgath-Pilser took his army across the Euphrates on rafts of inflated goatskin, scattered the Arameans, and penetrated to the shores of the Mediterranean, where he won trade agreements from the Phoenician city-states and, in recognition of his imperial status, was honored with the gift of a crocodile from none other than the Egyptian pharaoh himself. While visiting Egypt, Tilgath-Pilser also disported himself on a boat ride using a harpoon to slay, as he recounted, a Nahiru, that which they call a seahorse, probably a dolphin or some species of whale. During his long reign, Tilgath-Pilser launched 27 more campaigns against the vexatious Aramaeans, yet never completely subdued them. After his death in 1077 BCE, the routes to the Mediterranean were severed, and the Assyrian expansion was checked by steady pressure from the Aramean tribes. Nearly another century and a half passed before Assyria resumed the march to empire that would win supremacy over the Middle East. By then, the pattern of Assyrian life was fully formed.